there's an absolute shift, because what we're actually seeing is we're seeing some collaborative engagement between the two men. So it's very, very, very different to some of the meetings that we've seen in the past between the two men. I'm Dr. Beth Dawson. I'm a body language expert and a behavior analyst, and I have been observing and analyzing body language for over 20 years. Let's have a look at President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky's behavior and body language today, and just have a look at and see how it contrasts to past meetings, and see if we can see any shifts in their behavior and their body language. The first thing that I noticed was when they were greeting each other in front of the White House. So we see Donald Trump, his baseline, what we call his baseline behavior, his usual behavior, his trademark presence. He's leaning slightly forward. He occasionally lifts his posture. So this is very, very typical of Donald Trump. He's reasserting control. His gestures are often very, what we call open gestures, very purposeful gestures. He wants to show a desire to be decisive, to be commanding. So there wasn't anything particularly different to his behavior when he was greeting Volodymyr Zelensky. What we see, though, is something slightly different in terms of how Volodymyr Zelensky reacted. So this is when they first meet each other, when they first greet each other, and there's the handshake. And we see that Volodymyr Zelensky, his baseline behavior is less expansive, but he's giving his handshake, and what we see is his passive arm. So it's what we call a one-sided handshake. So his passive arm is resting by his side. We don't always see this. We've seen Volodymyr Zelensky in previous situations, previous handshakes, previous greetings, where he's bringing his passive, what we call the passive arm, in to, perhaps touch an elbow or to kind of touch the other person. We don't see that here. And that's actually very interesting. So what we see is that he's standing upright, he's balanced, he's smiling, so he's showing, cordiality. But the fact that he's keeping his free arm sort of by his side, if you like, this is showing that he doesn't want to over-signal warmth or dominance. It's probably a deliberate act of restraint. So what we see with what we call a one-armed handshake is that often this is the intention to show that something is not personal. It's about keeping a distance. It's about saying, I'm comfortable, I'm being confident, I'm being assertive, but I don't need to over-signal warmth, if that makes sense, okay? So it's probably, in Zelensky's case, it's a deliberate act of restraint. He's trying to convey professionalism. He's trying to keep the encounter neutral, rather than sort of overly friendly. He doesn't want to appear he doesn't want to sort of show these personal gestures, overly warm gestures. So that was something that I noticed that was a little different from some previous handshakes that we've seen.
President Trump, sir, do you believe you can convince Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine?
Yep, we can.
So when they face the press, Trump is asked whether he can persuade President Putin to end the war. So his immediate response is to straighten. We see that he straightens his body, and he's basically saying, yes, absolutely. And in fact, he says it vocally. He says, yes, we can. What we see then with Volodymyr Zelensky is that his reaction is quite subtle, but he presses his lips closely together. So this is a classic microexpression of emotional containment. It's often linked to tension, frustration. It can also be a suppressed response. So he's obviously not going to contradict Donald Trump, but this does show a slight sort of, perhaps a little bit of discomfort with this very sort of vocal, yep, we can. It's obviously the strain. He's representing, a nation at war, obviously. He's smiling, he's showing cooperation, but that very subtle sort of the lips pushing together does show that he's feeling that strain and he's feeling that frustration. And he's obviously trying to regulate his emotions. So I saw something very different in Volodymyr Zelensky's demeanor and his body language. And one of the things that I particularly noticed, in fact, I noticed it almost immediately, was his what we call, so in body language terms, we call it, we talk about the vocal range or the vocal landscape. And I noticed something very interesting is that his vocal landscape or his vocal range was much lower and flatter than usual.
I think we have important dialogues, and I think we begin to understand each other. Yes, and I know that President is briefed very well about situation in the battlefield.
So we always look at baseline when we're talking about body language. We always look at baseline, we look at context. His baseline communication is he's often known for being quite emotional. Even though he's quite contained and restrained, he does have quite an emotional way of communicating. We often talk about an emotive delivery. And what's really interesting is that the first thing I noticed during the press conference was that his voice was carrying much less variation, much less energy. There could be several reasons for this. I mean, obviously this shift may reflect, it could be emotional fatigue, it could be strain, it could also be deliberate control. It could be strategic, it could be a strategic attempt to project steadiness, authority. We would have to sort of look into this a little bit more to really understand, what it is reflecting. But that vocal difference, that flatter tone is absolutely present. We can hear it. And we hear it throughout the press conference. There's just a few moments when he becomes much more animated, much more emotional. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So in body language terms, a lower pitch is something that we do associate with more seriousness, more authority. So, for example, any of us, if we want to, immediately be perceived or be, more serious, more authoritative, we can lower our tone. It's a well-known it's a well-known technique, if you like, when we're talking about body language, when we're talking about public speaking, for example. We often talk about lowering the tone, using a more grave vocal language, if you like. So we could also imagine as well that, Volodymyr Zelensky, obviously there is a lot of emotional toll. He's been going through, obviously, a huge amount of stress and strain, the sustained pressure. So, this could also account for this difference in the vocal sort of range that he is using. It's not a disengaged tone. We don't hear a disengaged tone. Absolutely not. It's most definitely more contained. He is opting for gravity. He's talking to the press. We see him looking around. He's looking at the press. He's talking to the press. Most definitely. He's listening to the questions. He's turning his body towards the press. So it's not a disengaged tone. But, it's definitely different and a shift to what we have seen in, previous meetings, for example, or previous press conferences. We do see passion from Volodymyr Zelensky. We do see emotion.
But they can have our thousands of drones. That's why where we can work together, where we can strengthen American production.
It's actually very interesting because we suddenly see much more animation. We see his eyebrows moving up. So often when this happens, the eyebrows raising, this is for emphasis. We see him, he's opening his palms, he's opening his hands. He's talking about the fact that, the Ukraine can also, there's this discussion going on about the Tomahawks and the drones. And he's saying, well, in Ukraine, we have drones. We have drones. We can provide drones for the United States. It's very interesting to observe this exchange, because what we're actually seeing is we're seeing some collaborative engagement between the two men. So Volodymyr Zelensky is, he's underscoring Ukraine's strategic positioning by saying, that they have drones, we can offer drones to the United States. And what's really interesting is that President Trump responds in agreement and he acknowledges it. And he says, absolutely. So there's a mutual respect. There's an idea of this idea of cooperation between the two of them, understanding. There's composure. So it's very, very, very different to some of the meetings that we've seen in the past between the two men. So we're seeing two leaders. They're recognizing the political value of appearing aligned. And they're not only recognizing that, obviously, but they're emphasizing that alignment. And it's absolutely evident. And that is a big shift to some of the meetings that we've seen previously.
What do you see as the biggest difference in diplomacy between President Trump and President Biden?
There's a question from a journalist about comparing the two presidents, President Biden, President Trump. And that's actually very interesting. So Volodymyr Zelensky, there's a pause. So remember, obviously, this press conference isn't in his native language. His English is very good. He's been having, discussions in English for a long time. So his English is good, but there's a pause. It's a marked pause. He's obviously thinking about how to respond to this in a very diplomatic way. And what's really interesting is he kind of doesn't respond. If you listen back, he doesn't respond to the question. He says, well, President Trump is a president now, so he has a chance to end this war. And President Biden is no longer president, so he can't end the war. So you see that he kind of sidesteps. He doesn't answer the question directly. He purposefully avoids answering the question directly. And in fact, what is very interesting is that we then see President Trump who then does answer the question. And then he leads it right into, he's very, well, we know his communication style is very direct, and he leads it right into competence and incompetence. So he answers the question, if you like, for Volodymyr Zelensky or for the press. But it's very interesting to see that Volodymyr Zelensky very, very gracefully sidestepped that question. He answers it, but he doesn't answer it in the way perhaps that President Trump would have liked him to have answered it. Hence why President Trump then interjects and says, well, competence, incompetence. And, he makes his point. And that was an interesting one. So we see, again, this shows us that Volodymyr Zelensky, very careful, very cautious, very diplomatic. He's thinking about what he's saying. He's thinking about his words. He's a very, he's in a, not, obviously everyone can see this, he's not in an easy situation at all. And he has been in a very difficult situation in the past. And we all saw this with President Trump. So, he's cautious. He's very cautious. So the general takeaway for me is we see a shift in terms of the calibration between the two men. We definitely see an alignment. We're seeing agreement. We're seeing sort of two performances of power. We see one performance that's extremely commanding, authoritative. The other is more quiet and deliberate, but we definitely see two leaders that are aligning and on the same page. There's an absolute shift in terms of what we have seen in the past when we've, the tension, especially in February, was palpable. I think everybody could see that tension. Whereas what we're seeing here is definite alignment. Now, whether that will, what will be the future of that alignment, we'll have to wait and see.